Just today. Okay. So we're going to be talking today. We've got one day to cover the 1920s. Congratulations. Here we go. But we can do it. So we're going to start off by going back to that 1920 election. Who gets elected in 1920? Warren G. Harding. What party does he belong to? The Republican Party. What does he promise? Return to normalcy. That means we're going to kind of go backwards to before progressivism. Good. And what do you notice about the patterns that you see on this map? Hello, Solid South, right? Hello, Solid South. Harding might have been from Tennessee. I'm not really sure why Tennessee votes Republican this time. But anyway, remember the South is still voting as one giant block against Republicans because they have yet to let go of Reconstruction. You know, they're mad about it still. And so that's sort of like, this is a pretty clear victory. People are kind of tired. They were frustrated with how World War I ended. There's this real sense of like, we just want anything else. We want not what we just got through with. And so Harding's the guy. So again, Harding wants us to go back before those regulations. He thinks that like America's done too much to try to like be all moralistic and fix problems. We should focus more on ourselves and what makes us better and strong. And so what we're going to talk about now are just sort of the general Republican policies of the 1920s. Now, I want to caution you, some of these sound fairly familiar, like to current Republican policies, but the parties are going to flip-flop one more time completely before we get to the present day. So I don't want you to put into your brain, oh, it's just like today's Republicans, and then like let it stick there because you'll be all screwed up when we get to the 1950s and 60s. Okay? So this does sound kind of like today's modern Republican policies, but we're looking at these as the Republicans of the 1920s. And so beginning with Harding, their policies look like this. We're going to cut taxes. We're going to cut spending. We don't need to be providing all these resources for poor people or like spending money on investigating all kinds of corruption or whatever. We're going to cut regulations. Let businesses do what they do best. Let them make money. Let them invest. You know, who are we to stand in the way of progress? And finally, we're going to raise tariffs because America should focus on America and not, you know, allow other countries to outcompete our industry. All right? Pop quiz. What are the four big tenets, don't look at your notes, of the Republicans in the 1920s? Cut taxes, cut spending, cut regulations, raise tariffs, right? Cut, and then raise those tariffs, right? So it's all very economic based. We're not interested in social policy. We want to move on from there. So Harding's administration is sort of plagued by scandal. There's quite a few of them, but the most famous of which is called the Teapot Dome scandal. And it's called that because it has to do with a like area of federal land that includes this like rock outcropping thing. And it, if you squint and maybe have consumed a little bit of caffeine, might look like a teapot. You know, like here's a little spout. Short. No? Anyway, so this is Teapot Dome. So Teapot Dome is on some federal lands that have been set aside as a national oil reserve. What that means is that we know there's oil there, but we are, like, the government is protecting this land because if ever we were in a war where we, like, ran out of oil, we would need to have more oil we could get, right? So it's an oil reserve. It's for emergencies. We can get some oil here. Now, technically speaking, it is not illegal for the government to allow companies to use federal lands, including for drilling. So, like, it's not illegal to allow private companies to come and drill on federal lands. In fact, today, private companies are doing a lot of work on federal lands. They get special permits to do it. They have to follow special, like, environmental regulations, but they do. They're able to go and collect lumber from some federal forests. They're able to drill in some particular areas. Like, they do these things. So that's not illegal. Kind of illogical, right? If this is an oil reserve, why would we let somebody drill on it if we're supposed to be holding it in reserve, you know? But not illegal. You know what is illegal? Bribes. Bribes are totally illegal. So although it's not illegal to allow a private company to drill on this land for oil, when Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall took bribes in order to allow some companies to drill on this land, that was illegal, and it was like a huge deal. And he gets fired, and it's problematic. Interestingly, you know, have you ever heard the phrase, I need a fall guy? Like, hey, we just stole from the bank, like one of us needs to get caught so the rest of us can get escape or something, the fall guy. That actually comes from Albert Fall. There is this sense that perhaps others in the Harding administration were guilty of taking bribes, but Fall took the fall, and he's the one who gets ousted. Anyway, so plenty of corruption to go around. But sort of Harding had more luck with his Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, who's really famous. Like Carnegie Mellon University, for example, has to do with Andrew Carnegie, and Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon. And so Mellon really believes that the United States' tax policy needs to be reformed. He is big into tax reform. And his argument is, one, again, that resonates with modern conservatives, that if taxes are too high, that they simply won't get paid. We won't make enough money that way. When taxes are high, businesses don't invest here. They find ways to avoid paying their taxes, whatever it is. So he proposes really, and follows through with, really significant tax cuts. So you can see on the chart here, taxes at the beginning of 1920 for wealthy Americans were about 60%, their tax rate. But by the second half of the 1920s, the tax rate has been cut all the way down to about 25%. And as this chart shows, we really do see an increase in tax revenues as a result of these cuts. And I would caution you from concluding, therefore, that every time we cut taxes, we see increased revenues. Because you'll learn in Mr. Pratt's class next year about something called the Laffer curve, which looks like an upside-down parabola. And the Laffer curve is theoretical, but is well justified, like well supported. It's theoretical, not like imaginary, just theoretical, like it doesn't have to do with specific numbers. And the Laffer curve says that at some point, cutting taxes does lead to more tax revenue, right? Like if we cut taxes and businesses like now have a whole bunch more money to expand, and they do, then now they're going to produce more stuff, which means they're going to have a higher like profit, and so they'll pay more taxes on this profit, or like a smaller percent of a larger profit is still a larger amount of tax revenue. But the Laffer curve has the other half, right? Which is that on the other hand, there are times at which cutting taxes will decrease revenues. Like if taxes are already low and we cut them even lower, we're probably not going to see increased revenues. So just kind of keep that in mind, that it worked here, but wouldn't always work. Anyway, so we're going to cut taxes, and this is going to be like Mellon's big idea. So that's cool. But then Harding dies. Very suddenly, as this newspaper says, he's like sitting next to his wife. She's reading something to him, and she turns over, and like he's dead. So it was all very sudden, and so it was either an aneurysm or a stroke. I can't remember. Some brain something. I'm 90% sure it was brain related, but not 100% sure. Anyway, he dies. That I'm 100% sure of. So his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, is going to become the president. So he comes into office in 1923, right? Harding serves only 3 years, and then he dies. Coolidge will finish out that term and then run one time on his own. His famous, like, sort of slogan or whatever, the business of the American people is business. Sometimes he said, the business of the American government is business, meaning what does he think is the most important interest to protect? Business, right? He's going to be very pro-business. Saying business a lot makes it sound like a nonsensical word. Business. Anyway, okay. So when he runs on his own account, so he finishes out Harding's term, he runs on his own in 1924, and looky there. Yeah, so hello, Solid South. And then Robert La, remember he was a progressive? Remember he was all about political reforms? He's like, hold on, America, we can't abandon progressivism. We need to keep working for reform. And he wins Wisconsin, but nowhere else. So Coolidge is going to win a pretty resounding electoral victory in 1924. And one of my favorite Coolidge stories goes like this. So Coolidge was known as being a man of very few words. He just didn't like to talk much, you know. So he was uncomfortable giving public speeches. He was very stiff. He would always read like directly from a paper. He'd have really short speeches. He wasn't like a people person, which I guess tells you how different the presidency is now than then. Anyway, so at a party, I think it was his inaugural party, but maybe it was later. At this party, and there's members of the press, and one young female reporter sort of moseys on up to him, and she, I'm quite sure, is used to using her feminine wiles to get what she wants or whatever. And so, you know, she's trying to like get a cool story or whatever, and so she tells him, you know, Mr. President, well, here, I made a bet against a fellow who said it was impossible to get more than 2 words out of you. And his response? You lose. And he walks away. Anyway, kind of a fun guy. But for review, what is he doing while he's the president besides not talking? Business, okay? And how does he do that? He's cutting taxes, cutting spending, cutting regulations, raising tariffs, right? That's what he's doing. Same thing that Harding was doing. Same policies, just a different guy. So then in 1928, Coolidge doesn't want to run again. He's not interested in running again. So in 1928, the Republicans are going to nominate Herbert Hoover. Hey, where have we heard that name before? The Food Administration guy, right? He had helped to run the Food Administration. He has kind of interesting backstory. Hoover was orphaned at a fairly young age. And he is like adopted or taken in by this family out in the West somewhere, I don't know, Wyoming or somewhere rugged. And they don't love him very much. You know, they don't like give him snuggles or whatever. So he has a pretty rough childhood. And, but nevertheless, he like works his way through, you know, his childhood, and then he goes off and pays his way through college and law school, like by working in the evenings and taking on all this extra responsibility. He doesn't have any family or connections. He's not a, like, you know, somebody from the elites or whatever, but he manages through like the brilliance of his ability to get noticed by people. He gets appointed to be the leader of the Food Administration. So he has kind of a cool backstory. That'll be important later. Anyway, so Herbert Hoover is running for the Republicans. His Democratic opponent is this guy. His name is Al Smith. Now, the biggest part of Al Smith's platform was that he was opposed to prohibition. He believed that we should repeal the 18th Amendment. They called him a wet as opposed to a dry. Right? So he believes that we should repeal prohibition and like allow alcohol again, which is pretty popular, at least in urban areas. But I need you to hold on to your chairs for a moment because there's something very scandalous about Mr. Smith. And don't tell your mothers I told you this. He's Catholic.
Oh no.
I know. And you'll notice that even the solid South is not that solid because they draw the line at voting for Catholics. Papists are more than America can handle. So the biggest controversy actually wasn't getting rid of the 18th Amendment. That was, you know, relatively uncontroversial compared to his Catholicism, right? He's gonna the Pope is gonna rule over America. He's gonna be un-American and make us worship statues or something. I don't know. It was rough. Have I told you that I'm Catholic? Because I'm totally Catholic. Anyway, here we go. So Al Smith is definitely not going to win. He doesn't even win the entire South, which is really just sad when you think about it. But so instead, we're going to see Herbert Hoover become president, and guess what he's doing domestically? He's cutting taxes, cutting spending, cutting regulations. Congratulations, you understand Republican domestic policy in the 1920s. Now we're going to shift gears, and we're going to talk about foreign policy. So we're backing up to Harding, 1920. And we're going to talk about foreign policy. And this might sound familiar to any of you who pay attention to this year's inauguration. This was part of one of Warren Harding's campaign speeches when he's running for office in 1920. He says, "Call it the selfishness of nationality, if you will. I think it's an inspiration to patriotic devotion, to safeguard America first, to stabilize America first, to prosper America first, to think of America first. Let the internationalists dream. Let the Bolshevists destroy. We proclaim Americanism." We proclaim Americanism. So, lots of times students will sort of like overgeneralize, and they will describe the foreign policy of the 1920s as being isolationist. It's kind of true. Like, we do tend to withdraw from international conflict, and we do raise tariffs to avoid excessive economic entanglement with other countries. It's not wholly false. But on the other hand, to call America isolationist in the 20s is sort of missing the point. I think that to remember that 1920s American diplomacy is very America first. It is very America-centric. It helps us to also include and account for the things we do get involved in. For example, in 1921, the United States hosts a naval conference, so a conference to talk about the balance of naval power in the world. And so there are other players that come as well, but the major people involved are the British, the Americans, and the Japanese. You're going, the Japanese? But the Japanese have actually become a huge regional power, right? So largely based on American trade and access to American technology, the Japanese have increased their industrial output significantly, and now the Japanese are far and above the most significant power in the entire Pacific world, right? So they are major players. And so the U.S. Kind of wants to try to avoid like an arms race, like a naval arms race. So the goal of the Washington Conference is to establish like some kind of stability for naval powers. And so they agree to these ratios. So for every 5 ships that the British, 5 tons of shipping to be accurate, but it's fine. Essentially for every 5 ships that the British have, the Americans can have 5 and the Japanese can have 3. So it's going to kind of stabilize those rates. You might go, why would the Japanese agree to having like fewer ships than America and Britain? Like, why would they sign on to that? Well, 2 reasons. The first of which is that the Americans and the British promised not to militarize the Pacific. So we have, of course, territory in the Philippines. The British have territory like Hong Kong and other smaller holdings. And so both the Americans and the British, they promised, we're not going to fortify our bases. We're not going to send a bunch of naval ships to patrol the Pacific. Like Japan, we agree that you get to be the regional power in the Pacific. Like, we're not going to threaten you. And so then with that guarantee, the Japanese kind of like the idea of having a slightly smaller navy because guess what? Navies are expensive. And Japan is now free to spend more of their money building their economy rather than trying to compete militarily with the Americans, along with the promise that the Americans are not going to threaten the Japanese. So that's kind of how that all turns out. Then there's this Dawes Plan. I'm going to hide this for a second while I talk to you about it. Well, so you can write down the Dawes Plan. And the Dawes Plan is an economic plan that is agreed upon by American like financial administrators. And it's supposed to be totally foolproof. But I hate to break it to you that you guys are not world-renowned economists and you are quite capable of figuring out where the flaw in this plan is. So we're going to start with the first part of the Dawes Plan, which is that American investments are going to be encouraged. We're going to provide financial incentives for like American banks to loan money to Germany. Pause. Why is that not a stupid idea by itself? It's actually kind of a good idea, sort of. Okay, but that's not what makes it a good idea. Pretty much, but that's actually why it's a good idea, because change track of thought. Have you ever seen shows where they flip houses? You know, they buy a house and then they fix it up and they sell it for like a huge profit or whatever. Are they going to make money flipping houses if they buy an already nice house? No, the way to make money is by buying like a bad house, it's all run down but in a good location or like has a good floor plan or something, and then they can fix it up and sell it for a huge profit, right? If we bought an already nice house, we won't make any money. So Germany's economy is kind of poopy at the moment, but they had been a really good economy, right, before World War I. And so the idea is if we can invest now when it's going to be super cheap because their economy is all falling apart, and they have the potential and like the strong probability of growing their economy again, right? So that's not a stupid idea. Investing in Germany is not a bad idea necessarily. It's the rest of the plan that's the problem. So we're going to send out $2.5 billion in loans to Germany. That's billion with a B, and that is dollars as in 1920 dollars, like not 2017 dollars. So this is a lot of money we're sending. We're going to send out $2.5 billion to Germany in loans, but the thing is, what that loan is supposed to do is rebuild the German economy. But what the loan actually does is provide a source of income for Germany, and Germany needs the income because they have to pay reparations. So about $2 billion of those dollars actually don't stay in Germany at all. They're simply used by the Germans to help pay off reparations to the Allies. So is America going to is the house going to be flipped? No, right? The money's supposed to go to like building, you know, putting in new floors and counters and stuff, and actually it's going to pay off other debts. So okay, that's part of the problem. So then they pay these reparations to the Allies, but do the Allies rebuild their economies? No. Because what was the U.S. doing during World War I? We were loaning and selling all kinds of stuff on credit to the British and the French. So they owe us a lot of money. So they're taking the reparations payments and they're sending them almost entirely right back to the United States. And then some, right? They're paying our loans off. So while this works, it's fine. Because like American private banks are like investing in Germany, but meanwhile they're getting all of their loans like paid back from the Allies. That's totally cool. It's sustainable, right? But say, I don't know, hypothetically speaking, some young National Socialist demagogue takes over in Germany and then stops paying reparations to the British and the French, then immediately we're going to stop getting our debts paid back while we are still out all of the money that we loaned to Germany. That's going to be kind of rough. I wonder if that would come down, I don't know, say 1929 or so? Would that be the thing? Yeah, kind of rough. So anyway, the Dawes Plan is inherently flawed because it is circular. We need the money to be safe somewhere, but, you know, there we go. Ooh, this is a fun story. Who is willing to be involved in a super awkward, perfect, Drew. Okay, Drew. It's going to get creepy here. Here we go. Hi, Drew, I would really like for you to be my very best friend. Don't you want to do that? And, like, I'll give you my phone number, and you can give me your phone number, and, like, I'll text you all of, like, the things that I'm doing every minute of every day, and then you can send me all of your information, and, like, if anybody ever talks bad about me, you'll totally have my back. And, like, say, right? And Drew is going, no, that sounds, like, really awkward, and like, he's actually smiling and nodding his head. But no, Drew is thinking, like, that's terrible. You're my teacher, and you're boring and old, and I definitely do not want to give you my phone number, right? So here's what Drew is brilliant. He's going to think of. He's going to go, he doesn't want to make me mad because I have to, like, give him grades and stuff, you know? So he's going to think, okay, how do I get out of this? Yes, Mrs. Rodriguez, but I think the whole class should be best friends. So let's get on, like, a group me, you know? And then we can send information that way, and you don't have to have my phone number. I don't have to have yours. We'll just, like, we'll just share this group me thing, and then we can all be best friends together, and no one will ever say anything bad about you ever, so I don't have to worry about that. I've totally, like, figured this out. Okay, let's do slightly less ridiculous. Here's what actually happens. France approaches the United States and says, hi, don't you want to have an alliance with us? We'd love to be allies. Don't we have so much to offer you, like cheese and wine, and we'll totally, like, defend you if ever you're attacked, because we have the world's best military. Not. Don't you want to be our allies? And the U.S. is like, absolutely not. We don't want to be allies with you. You get in trouble all the time, and you're, like, really bad at war. So the U.S. is trying to figure out a way to not hurt France's feelings. And so we propose this. You know what, France? Listen, that sounds great. But how about we don't want to exclude people. Let's be friends with everyone. Let's have, like, a vast international alliance where all the major countries can, like, sign on, and we'll all agree to, like, help each other out and to defend one another, and we will all promise not to go to war with each other ever. Doesn't that sound better? And France at this point is like, that sounds terrible, but they can't say no. So in the end, we get this Kellogg-Briand Pact. So the United States, France, and a whole bunch of other European countries sign this, treaty that basically says that we're never going to go to war. War is going to be illegal. No wars of any kind. The thing is, if you think about it, if someone breaks the treaty and, like, goes to war, what's the only way to respond? Also war, right? So it's really just, like, it makes us feel better. One of the newspapers at the time described it as the great international kiss. You know, like, it's totally meaningless. But here we are, pretending we love each other. There you go. Okay, so that's, like, politics and diplomacy, and now we're going to turn our attention to social issues of the 1920s and all that. So, you know, we're going to go kind of quickly because, well, we're always going pretty quickly. So there you go, quicklier. Because you already know most of this information, students tend to feel like they really like the 20s. You've read The Great Gatsby and all that, you know? Okay, so you know that prohibition is a thing, right? Which amendment?
21st.
The 18th Amendment. 21st is going to get rid of prohibition, but you're ahead of the game. So the 18th Amendment is going to have enacted prohibition, so out drinking, buying, selling, producing, and transporting alcohol is banned. What was the law that enforces the 18th Amendment? The Volstead Act, right? Okay, so that's in place. Now tell me, was the 18th Amendment successful? Was prohibition successful? Did fewer people drink? Yes, it is successful, but does it mean that nobody drinks? No, we know, you've read The Great Gatsby, that people are still drinking, especially in cities, especially the wealthy. So the effect of the 18th Amendment, number one, it does decrease alcohol consumption, but it also increases criminal activity. And in increasing criminal activity, these people who are just ignoring the law and going to drink anyway, it empowers, like, criminal enterprises. So this is Al Capone, right, this big mobster guy, and he gets hugely powerful during the era of Prohibition, because whereas before he could only sell illegal stuff to bad guys, you know, like in the underworld, now he can preside over, like, a bootleg empire where he's now selling to everybody. He can profit from all kinds of people who just, you know, the socialites who want to go and have a party on the weekends or something, right? So that's going to increase his profits, increase his power, and so on. It's not just him. There's other big, like, organized crime initiatives that are happening at this time. And so one of the problems with Prohibition is it really does sort of encourage criminal behavior, right? Because something that's fairly small has now been criminalized and becomes a problem. Another thing that we want to just remember that you already know is that urbanization continues, and in fact the year 1920 is a tipping point from America being mostly rural to America being mostly urban. So in 1920, for the first time, 50.1% of Americans live in cities. So we are now a majority urban country. And remember, if you live in the country, in, like, the rural areas, that sounds terrifying. right? Remember, like back before the Civil War, when we were getting all this immigration to the north? How did the South feel about that? Terrified, because all of a sudden this group that like this part of the country that is very different from them, has different values, is growing in size, which means growing in influence, which is scary. So rural parts of the country are really concerned. They feel afraid and threatened by urbanization, because these parts of the country that disagree, that have different ideas, different values from them, are growing in size, which means growing in political influence, which is scary if you live in rural areas. The automobile is going to become, of course, a big cultural phenomenon. Henry Ford is going to pioneer the assembly line, which means that he can produce his Model Ts for a much lower. He didn't invent the automobile, by the way. Like other people had invented the car way before Henry Ford gets involved in the business. But he does pioneer the assembly line, which makes his cars cheaper. So now, even his own. Also, he pays his employees really well, which is another sort of like innovation. He does it to avoid unions, but anyway, that's neither here nor there. So Henry Ford's own workers can, excuse the pun, afford his cars themselves, which means that more and more Americans have access to like real personal transportation, and this is going to have far-reaching impacts. It's going to change the footprint of cities. Cities are going to get physically bigger, like wider, because you can now live further away from the city and still drive into work each day. It's also going to increase mobility, like people can travel further from their home. They can. The country is going to become more homogenous, because like if you have to stay, if you don't have a car, then most of your life you're probably going to be in the same old town, right? You're in it, like your whole cultural idea, your background, your experiences are all going to come from this one little place. But if you have a car, if you can travel, you can visit other cities where they have a different culture. You can go to a different state. You see, so we see like cultural homogenization. That's going to be a part of this issue. But then there's also like a bit of scandal here, because cars allow young people to get away from their parents alone together.
No.
Boys and girls.
Not boys.
Definitely not boys. So there is a little bit of like some concern. Like the car is changing our lifestyle, and this is going to be bad. This is going to be contrary to like the values that we believe in. So there's a little bit of that. There's changes to the ideas of femininity, right? We know that in 1920 we'll pass the 19th Amendment. What does that do? It allows for women's suffrage, and like so we see like women's activism is going to continue. Culturally speaking, we're going to see like the flapper ideals, like women who bob their hair and like go for like more androgynous silhouettes as opposed to like being very curvy or whatever. This styles change. We're going to see hemlines coming up a little bit, and all of those things are cool and also terrifying for men. So like here's one: we men must grow a mustache. That's the one thing the girls can't do. All right. So there is this concern that like traditional gender roles are going to be thrown off. American like moral society is going to degenerate, because women are going to try to be men, and it's just weird. And so like consumer culture is going to sort of like overreact, and they're going to over-feminize, right? So here's one of my favorite ads. I don't mind housekeeping a bit, like, and here's the woman who is very feminine and all, just sort of nice and soft, whatever. Like this view that these new flapper women, like these modern women, this isn't what real women should aspire to. That real women are focusing on and enriching their homes and all this business. The radio is going to also play a role in all of this. So the radio isn't invented in the 1920s, but it becomes more able to be mass produced. So now nearly every home is going to have a radio in it. And I want you to think about what this means. Remember, before the radio, what kinds of cultural experiences could you have? Only the ones you could physically get to, right? The only kinds of concerts, the only kinds of music, the only kinds of stories, the only kinds of commentary you could hear would be the ones who were physically around you. But with the radio, now every night across America, no matter where you live, the rural parts of Montana or New York City, you can hear the same nightly programs. You can hear the same concerts, the same like stories being told. So again, like the automobile, this is going to contribute to cultural homogenization, meaning like we become more of like one American culture rather than a whole bunch of regional cultures where like people are very different from one place to the next. So there's going to be another big impact of that. I want to remind you of the Great Migration and the impact that it would have on the United States. So remember that we see African Americans moving into these northern cities, and so we know that they face discrimination, but in a way the discrimination is, well, it's not good. There's nothing good about discrimination, but it does have an important effect. So when African Americans move into these northern cities, are they allowed to like move into white neighborhoods and disperse and integrate? No, all kinds of discrimination, segregation abound. So African Americans end up pushed into what we might have called other, if they, like for an immigrant group, an ethnic enclave, right? African Americans live in black neighborhoods where they're going to work together and cooperate to try to survive. They share resources, all this business. Now, although that is degrading and discriminatory, it also allows for what we now call the Harlem Renaissance, right? Like, another way to think about it, remember we talked about slavery and like the lives of a plantation slave versus like a slave that worked, like that lived in a city, and how the slaves that lived in the city, they tended to have like a little bit more freedom, but also less culture, right? They were sort of like forced to embrace white culture because they lived in it. They were like kind of surrounded. But slaves on plantations, they developed strong cultural traditions, right? Because they lived together surrounded by other slaves. They worshipped together. They, shared communal experiences, this kind of thing. So if African Americans had moved north and dispersed among the cities, they might never have had the opportunity for collaboration that developed the kinds of wonderful traditions like jazz music, for example, that are possible because of these so-called like enclaves of Black Americans. So, for example, the Harlem Renaissance, which is obviously centered around a neighborhood in New York City, Harlem, is going to be more broadly referencing like this blossoming of like Black cultural contributions. And here's why that's important, because even white Americans like jazz. Right? Like, this is a cultural development of, like, from the African American community that is valued by the broader country. And so for the first time, we're going to see, like, people like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong, they're invited to, like, white clubs, fancy clubs, places that otherwise would have been completely closed to African Americans. And it's a tiny step, y'all. It's a really tiny step. But if a white person has literally never seen a Black person ever in their lives, except for, like, whenever Black people do crimes or something and are put on the front page of the newspapers, it's really hard for white Americans to feel like any kind of connection or any desire to like change the status quo. But this tiny step now, Black culture in some ways is being seen as valuable, and it's one step closer, it's one little foot in the door for the idea of civil rights. Black people do have a huge value to our society, and so we're going to slowly begin to see this shift. Langston Hughes, so both Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, these are musicians. Langston Hughes is a really famous poet of the Harlem Renaissance. He's going to write all kinds of really interesting ones. This one, I Too Sing America, is one of my favorites. Here's an excerpt. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. And it goes on. It's a very hopeful. It's like life sucks for Black people, kind of like that we're excluded. It's not fair, and it doesn't follow along with the ideas of America. But that there's hope, that we are growing, that the Black community is becoming stronger, is becoming more vibrant, and like we're going to show that we have this important contribution to the country. So anyway, so there's all of that. But there's a downside, right? And the downside of all of this like interaction is that we do see more conflict. In St. Louis and in Chicago, there are major race riots that are very violent, and as I'm sure you can guess, because America, go basically unprosecuted, right? So like lots of Black Americans are killed in these riots, and almost nothing is done about it. Here's a picture of the aftermath of the Chicago race riot. So huge devastation, neighborhoods destroyed, livelihoods lost, and very little that comes out of that. There is sort of like in the very end of World War I, there is a bit of a push, like, we're trying to make the world safe for democracy. Let's like improve on civil rights back home. But it mostly falls on deaf ears. And in reality, the bigger reaction is sort of the rise of the second KKK. Now, I do want you to differentiate between like the first KKK in Reconstruction and this like new Ku Klux Klan movement. They obviously have, racism in common. But unlike the KKK of Reconstruction, the KKK of the 1920s is nationwide. It is not just a Southern movement. It is across the country. I'll skip forward here. So these are the symbols. The blue dots, governor of the state elected with Klan support. Triangle, U.S. senator elected with Klan support. Little thing is lots of Klan violence in the 1920s. And you can see that this is nationwide. This is not something that is isolated in the South. It's nationwide. In 1925, 5 million Americans publicly admit to membership in the KKK. So this is a bigger, broader movement. It's also, as I like to, don't like saying about the KKK, but I think a good phrase for it is that they are equal opportunity haters. They don't just hate Black people. They also hate Jews and immigrants and Catholics and the new women flapper type people, and basically anybody who's not like a conservative white Protestant family. is going to like draw the ire of the KKK. So they're going to be very like opposed to change. In many ways, we can see the KKK at this time as a very reactionary movement. They don't like these changes that are occurring, and they want to shut them down. And they do so with intimidation and with violence. In fact, the Birth of the Nation, which should not be confused with the like modern film Birth of a Nation, which is a totally different thing. But the D.W. Griffith movie, it's a like the first like full-length silent film, and it was about the KKK in during Reconstruction, and it's like the most racist thing you can imagine. Like whatever you can think of as being racist, it is worse. You know, like actors in blackface, crazy stereotypes, like super, you know, like romanticized images of KKK members who are saving the damsels in distress. It is like the worst thing you can think about, and it is still to this day the most successful movie of all time. If we consider like the amount of money they spent to make it, the amount of money that they made, the amount of copies that were sold, the amount of viewings that were held to the present day, it is the most successful movie of all time. In 1925, the KKK hosts a march on Washington, where thousands of Klan members in full regalia show up and like march publicly down the street, waving their flags. And that just sort of tells you how brazen and public the idea of the KKK was at this time. This very strong reaction against the changes of the 20s. But after 1925, that's really kind of a high water mark, because in 1926, the KKK begins to come under a lot of scrutiny for corruption. The so-called Grand Dragon of Indiana, which is apparently what they call the leader, I don't know. The Grand Dragon Indiana is convicted of rape and murder, so like of like some little white girl that whatever. And so that sort of like calls into question like the morality of the KKK, because the KKK would like, you know, they'd make coloring books and like give it to all the kids, you know, at parades and stuff, and be like, you know, we're about promoting Christianity and, you know, God's plan for the earth or whatever. And so it's hard to be like, we like Christianity and also we like rape little girls is a thing, you know. There's also like a whole bunch of exposés of like the finances, like how wealthy the leaders of the KKK were getting off of like all these membership dues. So this scandal begins to come out at the end of the 20s, and so the KKK, you know, sort of has its big rise and then kind of falls back off again. And we really don't see the KKK rise again, you know, until the 50s. So there's that. Okay, so now we're going to kind of sort of switch topics again. So from like social change, and now we're going to look at sort of like tensions in society. And the 1920 Wall Street bombing kind of sets it all off. So Wall Street, there's several explosives that are planted along Wall Street. I don't remember, 10 or 12 people are killed, maybe it's 20 people. 19, good job. And so, and nobody really claims responsibility. The like investigation reveals that it was like some anarchists who were just like wanted to literally watch the world burn kind of thing. But it doesn't matter, because in Americans' minds, the fault lies with immigrants, right? Anarchism, these radical ideas, it must come from those immigrants, those people that are coming to our cities. They bring their crazy ideas. And remember, we're seeing the new immigration, right? If you look at these two maps, if you look at the board for a second. So here's a map of the, like the circles are proportionally sized by the number of immigrants coming from those countries. Here's in the 1880s. And then in the first decade of the 1900s, you can see we are really getting a whole bunch of those new immigrants, right, from Southern and Eastern Europe, a big shift in who we're getting. And there's just this really widespread suspicion of those immigrants. There's also more broadly a suspicion of unions, because they're associated with socialism, and then for a reason that is hard to articulate, associated with anarchism and violence. And so we're going to sort of see that Red Scare, and that's what we'll pick up on Monday with our activity. Thank you.